Picture this, a dimly lit intellectual salon in 1920s Vienna, where the smoke from expensive cigars mingles with the weight of revolutionary ideas. Two men sit across from each other at a worn leather table, their eyes locked in the kind of intense gaze that only comes when fundamental truths about human existence are about to be challenged. One man represents the pinnacle of rational thought. The other has just torn apart everything we thought we knew about the human mind. René Descartes, somehow transported from his 17th century world of mathematical certainty, adjusts his period coat and leans forward with the confidence of a man who built modern philosophy on the unshakable foundation of "I think, therefore I am." Across from him, Sigmund Freud, the architect of psychoanalysis, taps ash from his cigar with the methodical precision of someone who has spent decades excavating the dark corners of the human psyche. The question hanging between them like a loaded pistol: is the human self a unified, rational entity, or a fragmented battlefield of competing desires and unconscious forces? Descartes speaks first, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of philosophical tradition. My dear Freud, your theories, while certainly creative, fundamentally misunderstand the nature of human consciousness. The self is not some chaotic jumble of competing forces. It is unified, clear, and rational. He gestures with the confidence of a mathematician proving a theorem. When I declare cogito ergo sum, I am not speaking of multiple selves or hidden desires. I am speaking of the one, indivisible thinking substance that constitutes the essence of who we are. The mind, my friend, is distinct from the body, clear in its operations and unified in its nature. Freud chuckles, a sound that somehow manages to be both amused and deeply unsettling. Ah, René, your certainty is charming, truly. But tell me, have you ever wondered why you sometimes do things you cannot rationally explain? Why you might feel inexplicably drawn to certain people, or why certain memories seem to slip away from your conscious grasp? The Austrian doctor leans back, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a detective about to reveal a crucial piece of evidence. Your unified self is nothing more than a beautiful illusion, a thin veneer of consciousness floating atop an ocean of unconscious drives, repressed memories, and conflicting desires. Descartes straightens, clearly irritated. Illusion? Sir, the very fact that I can doubt the existence of my body, my senses, even the external world, while being unable to doubt that I am thinking, proves the unity and primacy of consciousness. The thinking self is indivisible. It cannot be split or fragmented, because thought itself is not a physical substance that can be divided. But that is precisely the problem with your approach, Freud interjects, leaning forward with the intensity of a predator sensing weakness. You speak only of conscious thought, of rational deliberation. You ignore the vast realm of the unconscious, where the real drama of human psychology unfolds. The room seems to grow smaller as these two intellectual giants prepare for battle. The tension is palpable, not just between the men, but between two fundamentally different ways of understanding what it means to be human. Freud continues, his voice gaining momentum like a steam engine building pressure. Let me tell you about a patient of mine, a respected businessman who came to me plagued by inexplicable anxiety. Through analysis, we discovered that his conscious, rational mind was in constant conflict with unconscious guilt over childhood experiences he had completely forgotten. His unified self was actually a battlefield between his ID, demanding immediate gratification, his superego imposing moral restrictions, and his ego, desperately trying to mediate between these warring factions. Descartes waves dismissively. Anecdotes and speculation. You build an entire theory of human nature on the troubled minds of your patients. But what of healthy, rational individuals? What of the clear and distinct perceptions of mathematical truth, of logical reasoning, of moral certainty? These come from a unified rational faculty, not from some supposed conflict between invented psychological entities. Invented? Freud's eyebrows arch dangerously. Tell me, René, have you ever had a dream? Have you ever experienced a slip of the tongue that revealed thoughts you did not know you were thinking? Have you ever felt the irresistible pull of desire that seemed to come from somewhere beyond your rational control? The philosopher shifts uncomfortably. Dreams are merely the confused activity of a mind not properly engaged in rational thought. As for desires, they originate in the body, not the mind. The rational soul can and should govern these bodily impulses through clear thinking and strong will. Freud laughs outright now, the sound echoing off the walls like a challenge thrown down before a duel. Ah, but that is exactly my point. You speak of governing impulses as if there were a war to be fought, a battle to be won. But who is fighting whom in this internal struggle? If the self is truly unified, why is there any struggle at all? The question hangs in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that neither man can ignore. Descartes sets down his cup of coffee with deliberate precision, the small clink against the saucer somehow amplifying the intensity of the moment. His eyes, sharp as mathematical proofs, focus on Freud with renewed determination. You ask who fights whom, as if the very existence of struggle proves fragmentation, but you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the battle. The philosopher's voice carries the weight of 3 centuries of rational tradition. The conflict is not within the mind itself, but between mind and body, between the rational soul and the mechanical operations of our physical nature. He stands and begins to pace, his movements precise and measured, like a geometry problem being worked out in real time. Consider this carefully, Herr Freud. When I engage in methodical doubt, when I systematically question everything that can possibly be false, what remains? Not the body, for I can doubt its existence, not the senses, for they often deceive, not even the external world, for it might all be an elaborate deception. But one thing remains absolutely certain, that I am thinking, and therefore that I exist as a thinking thing. Freud observes this performance with the clinical detachment of a doctor watching symptoms manifest. You speak of methodical doubt as if it were a purely rational exercise, but have you considered the psychological motivation behind such radical skepticism? Perhaps your need for absolute certainty reveals an unconscious anxiety about the instability of knowledge itself. Descartes stops pacing abruptly, turning to face his opponent with the intensity of a duelist who has just been challenged. You would reduce philosophical rigor to psychological pathology, the search for truth to mere neurosis. This is precisely the problem with your fragmented view of the self. It cannot recognize genuine rational insight when it occurs. But tell me, Freud continues undeterred, in your private moments when you are not engaged in philosophical demonstration, do you never experience conflicting thoughts? Do you never find yourself wanting 2 contradictory things simultaneously? Do you never act in ways that surprise even yourself? The question strikes something deep, and for a moment, Descartes hesitates. The pause is almost imperceptible, but Freud catches it like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. I see that you do, the psychoanalyst says softly, and in that moment of hesitation, we glimpse the truth that your philosophical system cannot accommodate. The self is not the transparent, unified consciousness you describe. It is a complex, dynamic system of competing forces, most of which operate below the threshold of awareness. Descartes recovers quickly, his rational armor reforming around him. What you interpret as competing forces within the self, I understand as the proper relationship between different aspects of human nature. The mind, which is truly me, must govern the passions and appetites that arise from the body. This is not fragmentation. This is hierarchy, order, rational control. He returns to his seat, leaning forward with evangelical fervor. Think of it this way. A king ruling his kingdom experiences opposition from rebellious subjects, but this does not make the king fragmented. The unity lies in the governing principle, in the rational soul that can step back from immediate experience and judge it according to clear and distinct principles. Freud chuckles, but there is less amusement in it now, and more of something darker, more predatory. Your metaphor of the king is more revealing than you realize, René. For what happens when the king's subjects rebel not just openly, but in secret? What happens when the very advisors the king trusts are feeding him false information? What happens when the king himself begins to doubt his own judgment? The room grows quieter, as if the very air is holding its breath for what comes next. This is precisely what I have discovered in my work with patients, Freud continues, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality of someone revealing long-hidden secrets. The conscious mind, your rational king, receives only carefully filtered reports from the unconscious realm. The real decisions, the real motivations, the real conflicts that drive human behavior, these occur in territories the king has never visited and about which he knows nothing. Descartes shakes his head vigorously. But this contradicts the most basic principle of consciousness itself. To be conscious means to be aware, to know that one knows. If there are mental processes of which I am unaware, in what sense can they be called mental at all? You speak of unconscious thoughts as if consciousness were merely one feature of thinking rather than its very essence. And there, Freud says, pointing his cigar at Descartes like a weapon, you reveal the fundamental limitation of your entire philosophical project. You equate the mind with consciousness, but consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of mental life occurs beneath the surface of awareness. He leans back, studying Descartes like a specimen under a microscope. Tell me, when you formulated your famous cogito, were you aware of every step in the process? Could you account for why that particular insight occurred to you at that particular moment? Or did it emerge from mental processes that remained hidden from your conscious observation? The challenge hangs between them like a gauntlet thrown down on ancient ground. The atmosphere in the room shifts perceptibly as Freud reaches into his jacket and withdraws a small leather notebook, its pages yellowed with age and thick with annotations. His fingers trace the worn edges with the reverence of a priest handling sacred texts. "Let me tell you about Anna," he begins, his voice dropping to the tone of someone sharing dangerous secrets. "A young woman who came to me paralyzed by symptoms that no physician could explain. Her right arm would not move, though there was nothing physically wrong with it. She experienced hallucinations, spoke in foreign languages she had never learned, and suffered from violent mood swings that seemed to possess her like spirits." Descartes shifts uncomfortably. Physical symptoms with psychological causes are well known. The passions can indeed affect the body through the interaction between soul and brain, but this does not prove fragmentation of the mind itself. Freud's eyes gleam with the intensity of a detective about to reveal the crucial evidence. But here is where your unified consciousness fails to explain what I observed. Under hypnosis, Anna would speak in a completely different voice with different mannerisms, even different moral attitudes. She would confess to desires and memories that her conscious mind categorically denied. Which Anna was the real one, René? Which voice spoke for the unified self? The question cuts through the philosophical abstractions like a surgical knife, exposing the raw nerve of human complexity. Descartes stands again, but this time his movement lacks the confident precision of before. There is something almost desperate in his pacing now. Hypnosis, hallucinations, these are pathological states, departures from the normal functioning of consciousness. You cannot build a theory of human nature on its breakdowns any more than you could understand the nature of vision by studying only the blind. "But that is exactly what I must do," Freud counters, his voice rising with passionate conviction. "It is precisely in the breakdown of normal functioning that we see the underlying structure most clearly. When consciousness fails, when the usual mechanisms of repression and rationalization cease to operate, we glimpse the true complexity of the human psyche." He stands now too, and the two men face each other across the small table like generals before a battle. "You speak of pathology, but tell me, is there a single human being who has never experienced a moment of irrationality, a flash of inexplicable anger, a sudden memory that brings tears for reasons they cannot understand, a dream that feels more real than waking life?" Descartes stops pacing, his hand moving to his forehead as if trying to ward off an approaching headache. These experiences, troubling as they may be, do not negate the fundamental unity of the thinking self. They are simply moments when the clear operation of reason is clouded by bodily influences or imperfect knowledge. Clouded? Freud's voice sharpens. Or revealed? What if what you call clouding is actually clarity, and what you call clear reason is the cloud? The philosopher's face flushes with indignation. Now you speak pure paradox. Reason is by definition clear. Mathematics is by definition certain. Consciousness is by definition transparent to itself. To suggest otherwise is to undermine the very possibility of knowledge itself. Freud moves closer, his voice dropping to an almost whisper that somehow carries more force than shouting. But what if the self that seeks this certainty, this transparency, this mathematical clarity, is itself a defense mechanism? What if the rational ego you champion so fiercely is nothing more than a frightened child, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control in a world that is fundamentally chaotic and irrational? The accusation hangs in the air like an explosion waiting to happen. Descartes' face cycles through a series of expressions, shock, anger, and something else, something that might almost be recognition. You would make reason itself a symptom of illness? His voice is barely controlled. You would reduce the highest achievements of human thought to psychological pathology. Not pathology, Freud replies, his tone suddenly gentle, almost therapeutic. Adaptation. The rational mind you describe so beautifully is indeed a remarkable achievement, but it is the achievement of one part of the psyche, the ego, in its struggle to mediate between unconscious desires and social demands. It is not the whole of human nature, but rather one strategy among many for navigating the fundamental conflicts that define our existence. He returns to his seat, gesturing for Descartes to do the same. Consider this. If the self were truly unified as you claim, why do human beings require such elaborate systems of law, morality, and social control? Why do we need to be taught how to behave rationally? Why does civilization itself depend on the suppression of certain desires and the cultivation of others? Descartes sits slowly, as if the weight of the question is physically pressing down on him. Because we must learn to govern our lower nature through reason. This is the very definition of education, of moral development, of human progress. But who is this we that must learn to govern? Freud presses. If the self is unified, who is teaching whom? Who is governing what? You speak as if there were multiple aspects of human nature that must be coordinated and controlled, which is precisely my point about the fragmented nature of the psyche. The room falls silent, except for the distant sound of carriages on cobblestones and the soft ticking of an antique clock. Both men seem to recognize that they have reached a crucial juncture in their debate, a moment where fundamental assumptions about human nature hang in the balance. Descartes sits in contemplative silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him like a cathedral of thought. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a new quality, not the aggressive certainty of before, but something deeper, more foundational. You force me to confront the very architecture of human experience, he admits, though his tone suggests this is a challenge he welcomes rather than fears. But I believe you mistake complexity for fragmentation, internal governance for internal warfare. He leans forward, his eyes brightening with the passion of a teacher who has found the perfect way to explain a difficult concept. Consider mathematics, Herr Freud. When I work through a geometric proof, there are indeed multiple steps, various considerations, different approaches I might take, but all of these occur within the unified activity of mathematical reasoning. The complexity does not shatter the unity, it expresses it. Freud strokes his beard thoughtfully. An interesting analogy, but tell me, when you make an error in calculation, where does that error come from? If consciousness is truly transparent to itself, how do mistakes occur? From insufficient attention, from hasty judgment, from allowing myself to be rushed by impatience or distracted by external concerns, Descartes replies quickly. But notice what you have done. You ask where error comes from, as if it were a positive thing that must have its own source. Error is simply the absence of truth, just as darkness is the absence of light. It requires no separate explanation. The psychoanalyst's eyes narrow with interest. But that is exactly what I find so fascinating about your position. You treat anything that does not conform to rational clarity as mere absence, mere negation. What if these supposed absences have their own positive reality, their own dynamic force in shaping human behavior? He stands and moves to the window, gazing out at the gaslit streets of Vienna. Let me tell you what I have learned from years of listening to human beings speak about their most intimate experiences. The errors you dismiss so easily often reveal deeper truths than conscious reason ever could. Turning back to face Descartes, Freud's expression grows more intense. A man tells me he loves his wife dearly, yet he forgets their anniversary every year. A woman insists she has no interest in her childhood friend, yet she dreams about him nightly. A father claims his greatest desire is his son's happiness, yet every conversation between them ends in conflict. Are these mere errors of attention, or do they reveal unconscious motivations that contradict conscious intentions? Descartes waves his hand dismissively, though the gesture lacks its earlier confidence. Human beings are embodied creatures, subject to physical limitations, social pressures, imperfect information. The occasional contradiction between intention and action simply reflects the difficulty of maintaining rational control in a complex world. It does not prove that the self is fundamentally divided against itself. But why should maintaining rational control be difficult at all? Freud presses. If the self is truly unified around reason, why should there be any struggle between intention and action if consciousness is really transparent to itself? The philosopher pauses, clearly wrestling with the implications of the question. Because we are not purely rational beings. We are rational souls united to physical bodies, and the body brings with it appetites, sensations, and limitations that the pure mind must learn to navigate and control. There, Freud exclaims, pointing at Descartes with evident satisfaction. You have just described a fundamental division within human nature, between mind and body, between rational control and physical appetite. How is this different from what I call the conflict between ego and ID? Descartes stands abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with an almost violent sound. It is entirely different because the division you describe is external, between two different substances, mind and body, not a division within consciousness itself. The mind remains unified, even as it interacts with and governs the body. But how can you maintain this distinction? Freud asks with deceptive mildness, when the evidence of everyday experience shows us that thoughts themselves can be conflicted, when we find ourselves simultaneously wanting and not wanting the same thing, when we experience guilt about desires we never consciously chose. The question strikes at something fundamental, and Descartes begins pacing again, but now his movements are less controlled, more agitated. These conflicts you describe are not between different parts of thought itself, but between clear and confused ideas, between rational judgment and irrational passion, between knowledge and ignorance. Yet you speak of these as if they were separate forces in conflict, Freud observes quietly. Knowledge struggling against ignorance, reason battling passion, clarity opposing confusion. How many warring parties can consciousness contain before you must admit that it is not, in fact, unified? The room seems to grow smaller around them, the philosophical stakes rising with each exchange. Descartes stops pacing and fixes Freud with a stare that seems to pierce through to the very foundations of human understanding. Because the alternative you propose is the destruction of everything that makes us human, he says with quiet intensity. If consciousness is really fragmented as you claim, if the self is really a battlefield of competing forces with no unified center, then rational discourse becomes impossible, moral responsibility disappears, and truth itself becomes meaningless. Your theory may explain certain psychological phenomena, but it destroys the very possibility of rational life. Freud meets his gaze without flinching. Or perhaps it explains why rational life is so difficult to achieve and so fragile to maintain. Perhaps the very intensity of your need for unity and certainty reveals something important about the human condition that your philosophy cannot acknowledge. The challenge hangs between them like a sword balanced on its point, ready to fall in either direction. The silence stretches between them like a taut wire, until Freud breaks it with a low chuckle that seems to emerge from some deep, hidden place within him. He reaches for his cigar, relights it with deliberate slowness, and lets the smoke drift between them like a veil. You know, René, there is something almost touching about your faith in rational unity. It reminds me of a patient I once treated, a brilliant philosopher, coincidentally, who came to me suffering from the most extraordinary symptom. Descartes narrows his eyes suspiciously. I hope you do not mean to analyze me as if I were one of your patients. Not at all, Freud replies with apparent innocence, though his eyes twinkle with mischief. This was someone else entirely, but his case was illuminating. He maintained absolute confidence in the power of reason to govern all aspects of human experience, yet he was plagued by a recurring nightmare that he could never rationally explain. The psychoanalyst leans back, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality of a master storyteller. In this dream, he found himself in a great library, surrounded by books containing all knowledge, but every time he reached for a book that might contain the ultimate truth he sought, his hand would pass right through it, as if the book were made of smoke. And in the distance he could hear laughter, mocking, terrible laughter, though he could never identify its source. Descartes shifts uncomfortably. Dreams are merely the confused activity of a mind not properly engaged in rational thought. They have no more significance than the random firing of nerves in a sleeping brain. But that is precisely what my patient insisted, Freud continues, seemingly oblivious to Descartes' discomfort. He dismissed the dream as meaningless, yet it tormented him night after night. Under analysis, we discovered that the laughter in the dream was his own, the voice of unconscious doubt mocking his conscious certainty. The philosopher's face flushes with anger. You speak in riddles and speculation. What evidence do you have for these unconscious processes? How can you claim knowledge of mental events that by definition cannot be observed? Freud sets down his cigar and fixes Descartes with a steady gaze. The same way you claim knowledge of clear and distinct ideas that cannot be doubted. Through careful attention to their effects, their patterns, their resistance to conscious control. He stands and moves to a bookshelf, running his finger along the spines of volumes on psychology and philosophy. Consider the phenomenon of repression. A memory too painful to bear disappears from consciousness, yet continues to influence behavior in ways the person cannot understand. The forgetting is not passive, like misplacing a book, but active, dynamic, requiring constant psychological energy to maintain. Even if such mechanisms exist, Descartes argues, they simply represent the mind's capacity to protect itself from harmful information. This demonstrates rational self-governance, not fragmentation. Freud turns sharply, his expression growing more intense. But who is protecting whom from what? If the mind is truly unified, why would one part of it need protection from another part? Why would rational self-governance require deception, concealment, and active forgetting? The question cuts through the philosophical abstractions like a scalpel, exposing the logical tensions in Descartes' position. The philosopher opens his mouth to respond, then closes it, clearly struggling with the implications. Furthermore, Freud continues, pressing his advantage, repression is not a conscious decision. People do not choose to forget traumatic events. The forgetting happens to them, often against their explicit wishes to remember. How can you maintain that consciousness is unified and self-transparent when it actively hides information from itself? Descartes begins pacing again, but now his movements are jerky, agitated, like a caged animal seeking escape. You describe pathological conditions, extreme cases where normal functioning has broken down. But the existence of mental illness does not negate the fundamental structure of healthy consciousness. Does it not? Freud asks softly. Or does it reveal that structure more clearly than normal functioning ever could? When the usual defenses fail, when repression breaks down, when the ego can no longer maintain its illusions of control, we see the true complexity of the human psyche. He moves closer to Descartes, his voice growing more urgent. I have sat with people as they remembered experiences they had completely forgotten, watched them discover desires they never knew they possessed, observed them act out dramas they did not consciously choose. The rational, unified self you describe is not the director of this drama. It is merely one actor among many, often the last to understand what is really happening. Descartes stops pacing abruptly, wheeling to face Freud with desperate intensity. But if you are right, if consciousness is really this chaotic battlefield of competing forces, then how is rational discourse even possible? How can we be having this conversation if neither of us is truly in control of our own thoughts? Freud smiles, but there is something sad in it, something almost compassionate. We can have this conversation precisely because the ego, the rational part of the psyche, is remarkably skilled at creating the illusion of unity and control. It takes the conflicting impulses, the competing desires, the unconscious motivations, and it weaves them into a narrative that feels coherent and purposeful. He pauses, letting the implications sink in. The self you champion so eloquently is real, René, but it is not what you think it is. It is not a foundation upon which everything else rests. It is an achievement, a construction, a constant work of integration that can never be finally completed. The room grows quiet again, but now the silence feels different, charged with possibilities neither man had anticipated when their debate began. Descartes slowly returns to his chair, his movements now carrying the weight of a man who has glimpsed something that threatens the very foundations of his understanding. He sits heavily, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. You would make consciousness itself into a kind of theater, he says quietly, where multiple actors perform roles that the supposed director does not even know have been written. Freud nods approvingly. Now you begin to understand. But not just any theater, a very special kind where the director believes he has written all the plays, cast all the parts and controls every performance, while in reality, most of the action occurs backstage, beyond his awareness. The philosopher looks up, and there is something almost vulnerable in his expression. But if this is true, then what becomes of moral responsibility? If our actions arise from unconscious forces we neither choose nor control, how can we be held accountable for what we do? Ah, Freud says, settling back into his chair with evident satisfaction, now you ask the truly important question. And here is where my fragmented view of the self actually preserves moral responsibility more effectively than your unified one. Descartes looks genuinely puzzled. How can that be possible? Freud leans forward, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher, explaining a crucial concept to a promising student. Because moral development, in my understanding, is precisely the process by which the ego learns to acknowledge and integrate the unconscious forces rather than simply being dominated by them. Responsibility does not require complete rational control. It requires honest self-examination and the courage to face what we discover. He gestures toward the window, where the sounds of the city continue their eternal rhythm. Consider a man who discovers, through analysis, that his seemingly rational business decisions are actually driven by an unconscious need to punish his father. Once he becomes aware of this pattern, he gains the possibility of choosing differently. The unconscious motivation does not disappear, but it no longer operates in secret. Descartes shakes his head slowly. But this seems to make moral responsibility contingent on psychological insight. Are only those who have undergone your analysis truly responsible for their actions? Not at all, Freud replies. Everyone has access to the basic tools of self-reflection, even without formal analysis. Dreams, slips of the tongue, unexplained emotional reactions. These are windows into the unconscious that are available to anyone willing to look. The tragedy is not that people lack access to self-knowledge, but that they resist it so fiercely. The psychoanalyst stands and moves to pour himself a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the side table. Your unified consciousness, René, actually provides people with an excuse for self-deception. If consciousness is transparent to itself, then whatever I am aware of thinking must be the whole truth. There is no motivation to look deeper, no reason to question the stories I tell myself about my own motivations. Descartes considers this carefully. But surely the capacity for rational self-reflection, for stepping back from immediate experience and judging it according to universal principles, provides exactly the kind of self-knowledge you describe. To a degree, yes, Freud acknowledges. But rational reflection can only work with the material that consciousness makes available to it. If the most important motivations operate below the threshold of awareness, then reason becomes merely an elaborate mechanism for justifying decisions that have already been made by unconscious forces. He returns to his seat, fixing Descartes with an intense stare. Tell me honestly, when you formulated your method of systematic doubt, were you fully aware of all the psychological motivations that drove you to seek such absolute certainty? Or did the method emerge from needs and fears that you did not consciously acknowledge? The question hangs in the air like a challenge that cannot be ignored. Descartes' face cycles through several expressions before settling into a look of profound thoughtfulness. I sought certainty because certainty is valuable for its own sake, because truth is the highest goal of rational inquiry. But why did you need it to be absolute? Freud presses gently. Why was probable knowledge, the kind that suffices for most human purposes, not enough for you? What was it about doubt and uncertainty that you found so intolerable? Descartes opens his mouth to respond, then closes it again. For the first time in their conversation, he seems truly at a loss for words. Freud's voice grows softer, almost therapeutic. Perhaps your philosophical system, brilliant as it is, serves certain psychological functions that you have never fully acknowledged. Perhaps the unified, rational self you defend so eloquently is not just a philosophical position, but a psychological necessity, a way of maintaining the illusion of control in a world that often feels chaotic and threatening. The room grows very quiet. Both men seem to realize they have reached a moment of profound importance, not just for their debate, but for their understanding of what it means to be human. Descartes finally speaks, his voice barely above a whisper. If you are right, then philosophy itself becomes a kind of symptom, and truth becomes secondary to psychological comfort. Not secondary, Freud corrects gently, but intertwined with psychological motivation in ways that pure reason cannot acknowledge. The search for truth and the need for psychological security are not enemies, they are partners in the complex dance of human consciousness. The gas lamps flicker as evening settles over Vienna, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the salon. Both men sit in contemplative silence, the weight of their exchange settling around them like dust after a storm. The philosophical battle lines drawn at the beginning of their encounter now seem less like fortifications and more like the remnants of an ancient conflict whose original purpose has been forgotten. Descartes breaks the silence first, his voice carrying a quality that was absent before, a kind of philosophical humility that seems almost foreign to his rational certainties. I find myself in an unexpected position, Herr Freud. Your arguments have not convinced me that consciousness is fragmented, but they have forced me to reconsider what unity might actually mean. Freud raises an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by this shift in tone. How so? The philosopher leans back in his chair, his gaze directed toward the ceiling, as if the answer might be written there in the play of light and shadow. Perhaps the unity of consciousness is not the simple, transparent self-awareness I have always believed it to be. Perhaps it is something more complex, more dynamic, the ongoing achievement of integration rather than a given foundation. Now you begin to sound almost psychoanalytic, Freud observes with a slight smile. The ego's work of synthesis and integration is indeed ongoing, never complete, always threatened by forces it cannot fully control or understand. Descartes nods slowly. But here is where I still differ from you. I believe this work of integration is guided by rational principles that transcend the psychological forces you describe. The capacity to step back from immediate experience, to judge according to universal standards of truth and morality, this represents something genuinely different from the mechanical operations of unconscious drives. Freud considers this carefully, rolling his cigar between his fingers without lighting it. I do not disagree with you as much as you might think. The capacity for rational reflection is indeed remarkable, perhaps even unique to human beings. But I would argue that this capacity itself emerges from the complex interplay of unconscious forces, rather than standing apart from them. He leans forward, his expression growing more animated. Consider the development of moral conscience. A child begins with immediate impulses, hunger, aggression, sexual curiosity. Through identification with parents and other authority figures, these impulses become structured by prohibitions and ideals that eventually become internalized as the superego. The capacity for moral reasoning emerges from this process, but it bears the traces of its origins in unconscious identification and repressed desire. Descartes furrows his brow. But surely you acknowledge that moral reasoning, once developed, can critique and even transcend its psychological origins. A person can recognize that their moral intuitions arise from childhood training, yet still affirm certain principles as universally valid. Of course, Freud agrees, but this recognition itself is a psychological achievement, requiring the ego to mediate between different levels of mental functioning. The capacity for self-criticism, for transcending one's origins, is itself part of the complex dynamics of the psyche, rather than evidence for a unified rational substance. The two men sit quietly for a moment, each contemplating the implications of their exchange. The rigid opposition that characterized the early stages of their debate has given way to something more nuanced, more dialectical. Descartes finally speaks again. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Instead of whether the self is unified or fragmented, perhaps we should ask how unity and fragmentation relate to each other in the ongoing process of human experience. Freud nods approvingly. Precisely, the self is neither simply unified nor simply fragmented. It is a dynamic system that achieves temporary states of integration through the constant negotiation between competing elements. What you call the rational soul and what I call the ego are both names for this integrative function, though we understand its nature and origins differently. But the implications remain quite different, Descartes points out. If rational integration represents a genuine capacity to transcend psychological conditioning, then human beings have access to objective truth and universal moral principles. If it is merely one psychological strategy among others, then truth and morality become relative to particular psychological configurations. Freud pauses, clearly wrestling with the weight of this observation. Not relative in the sense of arbitrary, but contextual in the sense of being embedded in the full complexity of human experience. Perhaps objective truth is not something we possess through rational intuition, but something we approach through the honest examination of our own psychological processes, including the unconscious motivations that shape our supposedly rational conclusions. The philosopher considers this carefully. So you would make self-knowledge the foundation of all other knowledge? In a sense, yes, Freud replies, not because the self is the measure of all things, but because the unconscious distortions of self-deception contaminate every other form of knowing. We cannot see the world clearly until we acknowledge the psychological lenses through which we view it. As if by mutual agreement, both men stand and move toward the window, looking out at the lamplit streets where ordinary people go about their evening business, unaware that the fundamental nature of human consciousness has just been debated a few floors above their heads. You know, Descartes says quietly, there is something almost poetic in the idea that the search for truth requires us to confront the very forces that make truth so difficult to achieve. Freud chuckles. Poetry, yes, but also tragedy. The human condition involves a fundamental tension between the need for truth and the psychological defenses that protect us from truths too painful to bear. Neither pure reason nor unconscious impulse alone can resolve this tension. It requires the ongoing work of integration that both of us, in our different ways, have tried to understand. They stand together in contemplative silence as Vienna settles into night around them, two great minds having wrestled with questions that have no final answers, only deeper ways of asking them. In the end, neither man has convinced the other, but both have been changed by the encounter. The question of whether the self is unified or fragmented remains open, but the very process of wrestling with it has revealed something profound about the human capacity to question, to doubt, to seek understanding even when certainty remains elusive. The debate ends not with resolution, but with the recognition that some questions are more important for being asked than for being answered, and that the human self, whatever its ultimate nature, possesses the remarkable capacity to turn its attention upon itself and wonder about its own deepest mysteries.